I'm sorry, Miss Vance, but your father is currently finalizing the Nightingale transaction inside, and he explicitly ordered no interruptions, not even from the merchandise itself. That was exactly what the new security guard told me when I tried to enter the VIP hallway of the City Theater. I stood there, clutching the heaviest, most prestigious international piano trophy of my career, completely frozen. The merchandise? Was he talking about me? I am Clara Vance, 24 years old, and up until that exact moment, I was hailed as the luckiest piano prodigy across Europe. I had rushed straight from the airport to my father's private office to surprise him with my massive win. My father, Arthur Vance, was a faded musical legend, a man who obsessively controlled every single aspect of my life, from the food I ate to the clothes I wore. People always called him a dedicated, loving father, but standing in that dimly lit corridor in Bellaria, the illusion of my perfect, privileged life started to violently crack apart. The guard's arrogant smirk made my stomach churn. I didn't argue with him. Instead, I nodded politely, turned around, and pretended to walk toward the exit. But I knew the layout of this historic theater better than anyone. I quickly slipped through the old emergency exit, the one with the rusted hinges that barely made a sound if you lifted the heavy metal handle just right. The air inside the narrow ventilation shaft smelled like thick dust. I crept closer to the vent overlooking my father's soundproofed office. And why father was pouring a glass of expensive whiskey for a man I recognized instantly, a notoriously ruthless billionaire known for his underground dealings. Then I heard the words that would shatter my reality forever. I have trained her for 15 years to be the flawless face of your family, my father said, his voice smooth, calculating, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. $5 million to clear my debt, and the girl will belong to you right after the final concert. I stopped breathing. $5 million. I was literally being sold to pay off a gambling or business debt. The Nightingale, order the guard mentioned, wasn't a rare piano or a priceless piece of art. It was me. I was the Nightingale. And my father, the man who had raised me, was the one auctioning off my cage. And why whole life, I had been conditioned to believe that Arthur Vance was my absolute savior. He was a severe narcissist, sure, and a relentless control freak. But I always excused his toxic behavior as the normal eccentricities of an aging musical genius. I thought his obsessive scheduling, his strict diets, and his constant monitoring were just his extreme ways of protecting his prodigy daughter from the harsh world. But hearing him trade my entire future for a canceled debt hit me hard. The horrifying reality was that my entire existence was nothing but a calculated investment. The trap was set so deep, and I had never even noticed it until now, that I honestly do not remember how I got back to our ancient, sprawling mansion in the isolated hills of Bellaria. I just remember locking myself in my dark bedroom, staring blankly at the high ceiling, my heart racing in my chest. I desperately needed to think. I needed to understand exactly how deep this sick deception went. The next morning, the very air in the house felt heavily toxic. Exactly 7 o'clock, like every single morning of my miserable life, my father knocked sharply on my door. He walked in carrying a silver tray with a steaming cup of my daily herbal tea. He smiled affectionately, but knowing what I knew now, his eyes looked entirely dead, cold, and predatory. "Drink it all, darling," he said, his tone a disgusting mix of a strict command and a gentle caress. "Don't let the audience see a tired Clara. We have a massive week ahead of us." I looked down at the tea. For years, I had constantly complained about feeling lethargic, entirely compliant, and strangely detached from my own emotions. My short-term memory was always a little foggy, and I never seemed to have the physical or mental energy to ever argue with his demands. I had always blamed the grueling 12-hour practice schedules. But staring at that amber liquid, a terrifying new thought crossed my mind. What if the extreme fatigue wasn't from playing the piano? "Thank you, Father," I said, forcing the most convincing, grateful smile I could muster. I brought the porcelain cup to my lips, pretending to take a long, deep sip, but I kept my teeth tightly closed. As soon as he turned around to open my heavy blackout curtains, I spat the liquid back into the cup and quickly poured the rest into the soil of a small potted fern on my nightstand. He turned back, saw the empty cup, and patted my head like a good, obedient pet. "Good girl. Now get dressed. The piano is waiting." As soon as he left the mansion for his afternoon meetings, I took a metal spoon, scooped up the damp soil and a few remaining drops of the spilled tea from the saucer, and shoved them into a sterile plastic vial. I sneaked out of the back gate and took a cab to a private toxicology clinic on the far side of the city. I paid the exorbitant fee in cash, using the secret emergency money I had hidden inside a hollowed-out vintage metronome. I aggressively demanded they run the results immediately. Waiting in that sterile, blindingly white room felt like an eternity. Every single tick of the wall clock was a deafening reminder of the immense danger I was currently sitting in. When the senior doctor finally walked in holding the printed lab report, his expression was incredibly grim. "Miss Vance," he said slowly, adjusting his glasses, "the sample you provided contains a steady, highly potent dose of a mild nerve inhibitor." "A nerve inhibitor," I whispered, feeling the blood completely drain from my face. "Yes. It's a synthetic chemical compound explicitly designed to suppress the central nervous system. In small, daily doses like this, it causes severe lethargy, noticeable short-term memory loss, and a significant reduction in the brain's natural ability to resist commands or feel aggression. It makes the subject highly susceptible to suggestion and heavily, almost entirely dependent on whoever is providing their daily care." I walked out of the clinic in an absolute daze. My father had been intentionally drugging me, my own flesh and blood. He hadn't just manipulated my career and my finances. He had been chemically altering my actual brain chemistry to turn me into a compliant, mindless doll. The morning tea wasn't a loving remedy for my exhaustion. It was the direct, sinister cause of it. The puzzle pieces of my ruined life were aggressively snapping into place, creating a picture so horrifying it made me want to drop to my knees and scream. But I couldn't scream. If he found out I knew the truth, he would immediately lock me away, or worse, physically hand me over to that billionaire before I could even formulate a basic escape plan. I had to play his twisted game. I had to continue being the perfect, obedient nightingale. That night, I sat alone in the grand music room, my shaking fingers hovering over the cold, ivory keys of my grand piano. I mechanically played a soft, haunting melody. I knew he was listening from the dark hallway. He always did. He loved to control my sound just as much as he loved to control my mind. But as I played, a new, sharp thought violently pierced through the lifting fog in my brain. If he was truly capable of systematically drugging his own daughter for years, what else was he actually capable of? My mind instantly went to my mother. She had died in a horrific, fiery car accident exactly 10 years ago. I was only 14 at the time. My father had aggressively pushed the narrative that she lost control of the wheel due to a sudden, fatal heart attack. But right now, the word accident was a complete lie that I stopped playing abruptly. The sudden silence in the massive mansion was deafening. I looked around the shadowed room, my eyes landing directly on the heavy, locked mahogany door at the far end of the hall. The old storage room. It was where my father carelessly dumped all the broken instruments, including the upright piano my mother used to play when she was alive. I hadn't stepped foot in that room since the day she died. He had explicitly and violently forbidden it. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming, sickening urge to go inside. I needed to find something, literally anything that belonged to her. Maybe she had known about the drugs. Maybe she had desperately tried to warn me. I sat in the dark and waited until I heard the heavy, rhythmic snores coming from my father's master bedroom upstairs. Then, holding my breath, I crept towards the storage room door that was securely locked, but the mechanism was incredibly old. I used a stiff metal hairpin, a cheap trick I had learned from a stagehand years ago, and jiggled the internal pins. With a surprisingly soft click, the heavy door creaked open. The room was freezing cold, smelling heavily of black mold and forgotten, dead memories. And right in the center, draped in a dusty white sheet, was my mother's piano. I approached it carefully. I pulled the dirty sheet off, revealing the deeply scratched wood. I ran my trembling fingers over the keys, and one of them, the middle C, felt strangely loose. I pressed it down hard, and it didn't make a sound. Instead, it sank deep into the wooden board, popping open a small, hidden compartment underneath the music stand. Inside the dark compartment was a small, rusted iron key and a sealed wooden box. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I used the key to pry open the box. Inside were thick stacks of letters, unsent letters. The handwriting was frantic, rushed, and panicked. It was my mother's handwriting that I opened the very first letter. To whoever finds this, the crumpled letter read, Arthur is a complete monster. He is not just managing Clara. He is systematically manufacturing her. I caught him illegally adjusting her trust contracts today. He has been using her as a literal tool to extract money from shady investors since she was 5 years old. I am packing our bags tonight. I have to get her out of here before he completely destroys her mind and soul. My breath caught in my throat. She knew. She was actively trying to save me. I quickly grabbed another piece of paper from the bottom of the dusty box. It was a torn newspaper clipping about her fatal car crash. But right next to it, frantically scrawled on a stained napkin in her handwriting, were the words, "He cut the brakes. I heard him in the garage. If I die, it wasn't an accident." I collapsed onto the freezing wooden floor, violently clutching the napkin to my chest. He killed her. He murdered my mother in cold blood just to keep me, his perfect golden goose. The shock was so profound it physically hurt, radiating from my chest down to my fingertips. Every single note I had played for the last 10 years was forced out of me by my mother's murder, but the absolute terror wasn't over yet. As I sat there in the pitch black, clutching the undeniable evidence of my father's true monstrous nature, I heard a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards, right outside the storage room door. The heavy brass doorknob began to slowly turn. The doorknob slowly turned. The heavy brass clicked loudly in the freezing storage room. I scrambled backward into the pitch-black corner, shoving my mother's letters and the rusty key deep into the pockets of my oversized sweatpants. The door swung open, and the harsh hallway light sliced violently through the darkness. It was my father. He stood there in his silk robe, his eyes scanning the dusty room. "Clara!" he called out, his voice laced with a dangerous suspicion. I knew if he found the open compartment on my mother's piano, I was completely dead. So I used the only weapon I had left, the exact thing he had spent years creating. I started to cry, not just a few tears, but a full hyperventilating breakdown. I crawled out of the shadows, clutching my head, acting completely disoriented and terrified. I mumbled that I had woken up from a horrible nightmare and got lost looking for my bedroom. This was the beginning of my new role as the perfectly broken doll. The nerve inhibitor he had been slipping into my tea was supposed to make me submissive, lethargic, and entirely dependent. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I leaned heavily against him, letting my body go completely limp, whispering how much I needed him to protect me from the dark. The suspicion in his eyes instantly melted into arrogant satisfaction. He wrapped a strong arm around my shoulder, leading me back to my room, gently shushing me like a toddler. He honestly believed his chemical leash was fully secured. Over the next few weeks, I played the part so well that he completely let his guard down. He became incredibly reckless. He started making loud phone calls in the exact same room as me, openly discussing liquidating our assets, transferring massive funds to offshore accounts, and finalizing the sale of our historic mansion. He thought I was simply too sedated to understand a single word. Then came the private dinner where I finally met my buyer. My father didn't call him a buyer, of course. He introduced him as my new fiancé. His name was Marcus, the same ruthless billionaire I had seen bargaining in the theater office. Marcus was crude, loud, and looked at me exactly the way a wealthy collector looks at a rare, expensive vintage car he just purchased. Throughout the agonizing 2-hour dinner, Marcus didn't ask me a single question about my life or my interests. He just discussed my upcoming global concert, analyzing the physical condition of my hands and my market value while I sat there silently pushing peas around my expensive porcelain plate. When Marcus finally left, my father poured himself a large glass of scotch and looked at me with a sickeningly proud smile. He told me Marcus was going to clear all of his debts, and in return, I was getting a highly prestigious family. He literally called it my ultimate sacrifice for the man who gave me everything. I just nodded blankly, fighting a violent urge to vomit right on his expensive shoes. But I needed concrete, undeniable proof to take him down. The letters from my mother were a solid start, but a high-paid defense lawyer could easily argue they were written by a paranoid woman right before a tragic accident. I needed my father to confess out loud, and I knew exactly where to catch him. For the past month, I had noticed a very bizarre, highly secretive routine. Every single night, at exactly 2 a.m., my dad entered my music room. He would stay in there for almost an hour, locking the heavy doors behind him. I had absolutely no idea what he was doing in there, but I knew it held the key to his entire criminal operation. So I installed a camera and discovered the terrifying truth that I bought a microscopic, high-definition wireless camera online using the last bit of my hidden cash. I waited until he left for an afternoon board meeting and snuck into the grand music room. I carefully installed the tiny lens deep inside the wooden casing of my grand piano, right between the upper registers where the felt hammers hid the wiring perfectly. It had a clear, wide-angle view of the entire room, including his favorite leather armchair. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring intensely at the live feed on my phone screen. At exactly 2 a.m., the heavy oak doors creaked open. My father walked in alone. He wasn't there to admire the expensive instruments or listen to old records. He walked straight to the large, ornate fireplace at the back of the room and pressed a hidden button under the marble mantelpiece. A small section of the brickwork popped open, revealing a hidden digital wall safe. He typed in a code, took out a thick stack of legal documents and a small audio recorder. Through the camera's built-in microphone, I heard him press play. It was his own voice. He was practicing a speech. He was rehearsing a devastating, tear-filled eulogy. My daughter Clara was a fragile genius. The recording played, his voice trembling with fake grief. The immense pressure of her upcoming final concert was simply too much for her delicate mind to handle. Her tragic overdose is an unimaginable loss to the entire musical world. My blood ran completely cold. He wasn't just selling me to Marcus to clear a debt. The marriage deal was a total setup. He had secretly taken out a massive, multi-million-dollar life insurance policy on me, exactly like he did with my mother. Marcus was going to get his investment money back from a cut of the insurance payout after I died accidentally in his care, and my father would walk away as a grieving, incredibly wealthy victim. The camera then caught him meticulously crushing pills and adjusting the dosage of the nerve inhibitor on his desk, preparing the final, lethal batch that would eventually be used to stage my tragic suicide. I recorded every single agonizing second of it directly to my secure cloud drive. I finally had the terrifying truth caught on undeniable video, but a video on a phone wasn't enough to guarantee my safety. If I went straight to the local police, my father's immense wealth and powerful political connections in Bellaria could easily sweep the footage under the rug or frame me as clinically insane. I needed someone who hated him as much as I did. I needed someone who absolutely could not be bought. I reached out to Julian. Julian was a relentless, aggressive investigative journalist who had spent the last 5 years trying to expose the deep corruption in the city's elite arts district. My father despised him and had heavily blacklisted him from every major press event in the country. I used a cheap burner phone to send Julian a highly encrypted message containing a short, 10-second clip from the hidden piano camera. Within 3 minutes, my burner phone buzzed. Julian wanted to meet immediately. We met in the back booth of a loud, run-down, neon-lit diner on the absolute edge of the city limits. I wore a heavy winter coat and a dark wool scarf pulled high up to my sunglasses, so no one would recognize the famous Clara Vance. When I slid the loaded USB drive across the sticky diner table, Julian's eyes widened in disbelief. I didn't just give him the terrifying camera footage. I also handed him a custom-made, incredibly expensive lapel pin. I told Julian my plan. Tomorrow was my father's grand inauguration ceremony as the honorary director of the National Music Academy. I had bought him this pin as a loving, congratulatory gift from his devoted daughter. But deeply embedded inside that pin was a military-grade audio transmitter. I had spent hours carefully wiring a microphone into the metal backing. Julian looked at the evidence, his face transforming from pure shock into predatory excitement. We didn't just want to send Arthur Vance to a comfortable, white-collar prison. We wanted to completely obliterate his untouchable legacy in front of the entire world. We sat in that greasy diner for 4 straight hours, meticulously planning a live broadcast interruption during my final, globally televised concert. Every single technical detail had to be absolutely perfect. The timing, the audio feed, the visual evidence display. If we missed our cue by even a single second, my father's extensive private security team would shut us down, and I would be permanently silenced before midnight. I snuck back into the sprawling mansion just before dawn, my heart pounding aggressively against my ribs. I slipped back into my bed, pulling the thick covers up just as I heard my father's heavy footsteps walking down the hallway to deliver my morning, poison-laced tea. The trap was set. The evidence was secured. And the most dangerous man in my life had absolutely no idea that his perfectly broken doll was currently holding the sharpest scissors to his puppet strings. But what I didn't realize at that moment was that my father is a highly paranoid man, and a cornered predator is always one deadly step ahead of its prey. Did you honestly believe a cheap $20 burner phone was enough to outsmart the man who engineered every single waking moment of your pathetic life? The harsh, biting words hit me before my eyes even fully opened. I gasped, violently jolted awake by the sensation of freezing cold water being splashed directly onto my face. I blinked rapidly, the blurry shadows of my bedroom slowly coming into focus. My father was standing right beside my bed, towering over me. His face was entirely devoid of the fake, loving warmth he usually wore in front of the cameras. He looked like a pure, unhinged predator. Dangling from his right hand was the cheap prepaid phone I had used to text Julian just a few hours ago. He had found it. I had carefully taped it underneath the heavy wooden frame of my bed, thinking it was the one place his obsessive daily inspections wouldn't reach. I was completely wrong. Before I could even formulate a lie, he grabbed a fistful of my hair and violently yanked me out of the bed. I hit the hardwood floor hard, my knees bruising instantly. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. His voice was terrifyingly calm, which made it infinitely worse. He dragged me across the floor, through the long, dark hallway, and straight toward the heavy iron door at the very end of the kitchen, the entrance to the old, soundproofed wine cellar. I kicked, I screamed, I clawed at his expensive silk robe, but the nerve inhibitor had kept me weak for so long that I barely had the physical strength of a child. He threw me down the steep concrete stairs like a sack of garbage. I tumbled down, hitting the cold, damp floor of the pitch-black basement. The heavy iron door slammed shut above me, and the deadbolt clicked with a sickening, final thud. I was completely trapped. For the first few hours, I just sat in the freezing darkness, shivering uncontrollably. The basement smelled of wet earth, rotting wood, and decades of stagnant air. My mind was racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. How much did he read? Did he see the video attachment? Did he know about the microphone pin? If he knew about the camera in the music room, I was already dead. But as the hours ticked by, I realized something crucial. If he had seen the video of him confessing to my mother's murder, he wouldn't have just thrown me in the basement. He would have disposed of me immediately. He only knew I was communicating with Julian. He thought I was just a rebellious, ungrateful daughter trying to ruin his reputation before the big concert. He still needed me alive for the final performance. He still needed the $5 million from Marcus to clear his massive debts. Suddenly, the harsh overhead fluorescent light flickered on, blinding me. The iron door opened, and my father slowly walked down the concrete steps. He wasn't carrying my morning tea anymore. He was holding a solid steel heavy-duty wrench. He pulled up a rusted folding chair and sat directly in front of me, casually tapping the heavy wrench against his palm. "I intercepted your little text messages to that rat journalist," he said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Trying to leak my financial records? Trying to tell the press I'm a bad father who forces you to practice too much? You are exactly like your mother, weak, hysterical, and completely incapable of understanding the grand vision." He leaned forward, grabbing my right hand. His grip was like a vice, crushing my knuckles together. He pressed the cold steel of the wrench directly against my index finger. I stopped breathing. For a pianist, your hands are your entire life, your identity, your only real currency. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was attacking my deepest, most primal fear. "Marcus is flying in 30 of his most important business associates for tomorrow night's concert at the Royal Theatre," my father whispered, staring dead into my terrified eyes. "This is the most critical transaction of my entire life. If you miss a single note, if you look even slightly unhappy, or if you dare to try and pull any stupid stunts, I won't just kill you, Clara. That would be too merciful. I will shatter every single bone in your hands with this wrench, one by one. I will make sure you never play a single chord for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life. You are a piece of merchandise, Clara, and I will not allow my merchandise to depreciate its own value." He threw my hand back at me in disgust. I sat there rubbing my bruised knuckles, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to break my ribs. The old Clara, the drugged, compliant, brainwashed girl, would have broken down completely. She would have begged for forgiveness, kissed his shoes, and promised to be the perfect little nightingale. But that girl died the moment I read my mother's hidden letters. I looked up at him, forcing my face to remain entirely blank, burying the burning rage deep inside my chest. "I understand, Father," I said, my voice completely flat and dead. "I won't ruin the deal. I will play the best piece you have ever heard." He smirked, a sick, arrogant smile of total victory spreading across his face. "Good girl. Now you sit here and think about your absolute lack of gratitude. The security team will come get you tomorrow evening for dress rehearsal. Don't try anything stupid. The entire building is on lockdown." He turned off the light and locked the door again, leaving me in absolute darkness. I didn't sleep for the next 24 hours. I sat on the freezing concrete floor, starving, completely dehydrated and shivering from the cold. But my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The effects of the nerve inhibitor were finally starting to wear off. The intense brain fog was lifting, replaced by a crystal-clear, burning desire for total revenge. I went over the plan with Julian 1,000 times in my head. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. My father was right about one thing. Tomorrow night was going to be the most important performance of my entire life. When the heavy iron door finally opened again, it wasn't my father. It was two massive, heavily armed private security guards. They pulled me up by my arms and practically dragged me upstairs to the master dressing room. The mansion was buzzing with chaotic energy. A team of expensive makeup artists and stylists immediately swarmed me. They didn't even look me in the eyes. They just treated me like a silent mannequin, aggressively applying layers of thick foundation to hide my pale, starved skin and the dark, bruised bags under my eyes. They squeezed me into a breathtaking, custom-made crimson red silk gown. It was incredibly tight, making it difficult to breathe. It felt less like a beautiful concert dress and exactly like an expensive sacrificial wrapping, and why father finally walked into the room, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. He looked like the absolute picture of a distinguished, wealthy aristocrat. He inspected me from head to toe, nodding in pure satisfaction. Perfect. The billionaire's wife is ready for the auction block. But my eyes immediately locked onto his left lapel. My heart did a massive, violent flip inside my chest. He was wearing it, right there, pinned perfectly to the expensive fabric of his tuxedo, was the custom gold lapel pin I had given him. The microphone. He actually wore it, completely blinded by his own towering narcissism. He loved the idea of wearing a gift that proved his absolute control over his broken daughter. He had no idea he had just strapped a loaded gun directly to his own chest. "Let's go," he snapped, grabbing my arm aggressively. The ride to the Royal Theatre was completely silent. The city streets blurred by through the tinted windows of the massive, bulletproof SUV. When we pulled up to the grand entrance, the chaotic flashing of hundreds of paparazzi cameras instantly blinded me. The red carpet was swarming with the absolute elite of the city. Wealthy politicians, famous actors, and elite music critics were all aggressively pushing to get a glimpse of the legendary Clara Vance. My father gripped my arm so tightly his fingernails dug painfully into my skin, forcing me to smile and wave at the screaming crowds. We bypassed the main lobby and were escorted directly through the heavily guarded backstage VIP corridors. The energy in the massive theater was absolutely electric. I could hear the low, thunderous hum of 5,000 people filling the velvet seats in the main auditorium. I spotted Marcus standing near the VIP wing, drinking champagne and laughing loudly with a group of intimidating men in dark suits. He looked at me, licking his lips like a starving dog looking at a piece of fresh meat. My stomach churned violently, but I kept my face entirely frozen. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, Julian. He was disguised as a low-level stagehand, wearing a black crew shirt and a baseball cap pulled down low over his eyes. He was standing near the massive central audio mixing board. He caught my eye for just a fraction of a second and gave me a single, barely noticeable nod. The audio feed was successfully connected. The live trap was fully armed and ready. My father pulled me to a stop just behind the heavy velvet curtains. The crowd noise was deafening. The stage manager rushed over, holding a headset, sweating profusely. "Mr. Vance, we are live on the global broadcast in exactly 2 minutes. The stage is yours for the opening remarks." My father let go of my arm and adjusted his tie, looking incredibly smug. He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear. "Don't move a single muscle, Clara. When I introduce you, you walk out there, you smile for the cameras, and you play perfectly. If you try to run, my guards will break your legs before you even reach the exit." "I'm not going anywhere, father," I whispered back, staring directly into his cold, dead eyes. "I've been waiting for this exact moment my entire life." He smirked, turning his back to me, entirely oblivious to the double meaning of my words. The massive theater lights suddenly dimmed, plunging the audience into darkness. The heavy velvet curtains slowly began to rise. The crowd erupted into a deafening roar of applause as Arthur Vance confidently stepped out into the blinding spotlight, ready to deliver the performance of his life. But he had absolutely no idea that this stage didn't belong to him anymore. The nightingale was finally out of her cage. An entire world was about to watch the monster burn. "You look absolutely stunning in that red dress, Clara. But I genuinely cannot wait to tear it off your shaking body the second this little show is over." Marcus, the ruthless billionaire who had literally purchased my entire existence for $5 million, leaned into my ear and whispered those vile words right as I stood waiting behind the heavy velvet curtains. His breath smelled heavily of expensive scotch and cigars. He grabbed my waist, his thick fingers digging painfully into my ribs, treating me exactly like a piece of property he had already paid for. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I just stared straight ahead at the dusty floorboards of the backstage area, forcing my face to show nothing but cold, dead emptiness. I had spent 15 years being a perfectly obedient doll. I could hold the pose for just 5 more minutes. Marcus chuckled, slapped my lower back hard, and walked away to take his seat in the heavily guarded VIP balcony. Out on the massive stage, the hot spotlight was shining directly on my father. He stood behind the sleek, silver microphone stand, looking like the ultimate picture of dignified grief and paternal love. Through the backstage video monitors, I watched him carefully wipe a fake tear from his eye. He was delivering the opening speech, and he was completely playing the crowd of 5,000 elite guests. "My daughter, Clara, is a fragile genius," Arthur's voice boomed through the massive concert hall speakers, echoing with a sickeningly sweet tone. "Since the tragic passing of my beautiful wife 10 years ago, Clara has been my entire world. I have dedicated every single second of my life to nurturing her delicate mind, to protecting her from the harsh realities of the music industry. Tonight is not just a concert. Tonight is a celebration of our family's absolute dedication to the art." The crowd erupted into massive, thunderous applause. I could see wealthy politicians wiping their eyes and elite music critics nodding in deep respect. It was the perfect illusion. And right there, pinned firmly to the left lapel of his expensive tuxedo, the gold microphone pin I had given him was secretly broadcasting his heartbeat directly to Julian's hidden mixing board. The stage manager tapped my shoulder frantically. "You're on, Miss Vance. Go." I took a deep breath, feeling the last remaining traces of the nerve inhibitor completely leave my system. My mind was sharp, aggressive, and entirely focused. I walked past the heavy velvet curtains and stepped out into the blinding, hot glare of the center stage spotlight. The applause immediately doubled in volume. It was completely deafening. 5,000 people stood up, clapping and cheering for the legendary Nightingale. I walked slowly across the polished wooden floor, my heavy crimson gown dragging beautifully behind me. My father stood near the edge of the stage, smiling proudly at me. I didn't look at him. I walked straight toward the massive, 9-foot Steinway grand piano position directly in the center of the stage. I sat down on the leather bench. I raised my hands, hovering my fingers just inches above the cold ivory keys. The entire theater instantly fell into a dead, heavy silence. You could literally hear a pin drop. Everyone was waiting for the first brilliant chord of my highly anticipated performance. Instead, I slowly lowered my hands. I stood up from the piano bench, turned my back to the expensive instrument, and walked directly toward the main center microphone. A confused murmur started to ripple rapidly through the front rows. My father's proud smile immediately dropped. His eyes widened in absolute panic. He took a quick step forward, his hands twitching, but he couldn't do anything drastic without ruining his perfect public image in front of the cameras. I grabbed the microphone, looking directly into the sea of confused faces, and then looked up at the VIP balcony where Marcus was sitting. "My father always told me that music is the absolute truth," I said, my voice echoing loudly and clearly through the massive theater. "He told me that you cannot hide your true self when you are on a stage. So tonight, I am not going to play Beethoven or Mozart. Tonight, I am going to let you hear the actual, terrifying truth about the Vance family legacy." Before my father could even open his mouth to stop me, Julian executed the plan perfectly from the central audio mixing board. He violently slammed the master override switch. Suddenly, my father's voice blasted through the concert hall speakers. But it wasn't his live voice. It was the secret audio recording I had captured from the hidden piano camera just days ago. "I have trained her for 15 years to be the flawless face of your family." The recording of my father echoed aggressively through the massive room. $5 million to clear my debt, and the girl will belong to you right after the final concert. The audience gasped loudly. The sound was like a massive wave of shock crashing over the seats. But Julian wasn't done. He hit the second switch. The immense pressure of her upcoming final concert was simply too much for her delicate mind to handle. The recorded voice of my father continued, perfectly clear and devoid of any emotion. Her tragic overdose is an unimaginable loss. The massive, high-definition projector screens behind me, the ones normally used to show close-up artistic angles of my hands playing the keys, suddenly violently flickered to life. Instead of sheet music, the screens displayed the crystal-clear video of my father standing in the music room at 2 a.m. The entire theater watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as the 50-foot screen showed Arthur Vance meticulously crushing the nerve inhibitor pills and adjusting the lethal dosage for his own daughter. Then, the screens aggressively flashed to the next piece of evidence. High-resolution scans of his massive offshore debt ledgers. The forged life insurance documents with my forged signature. And finally, the crumpled, stained napkin written by my mother right before her fatal car crash. He cut the brakes. I heard him in the garage. If I die, it wasn't an accident. Total, absolute pandemonium violently erupted inside the theater. People in the front rows started screaming loudly. Guests were jumping out of their seats. The elite investors who had just praised him were now backing away in pure disgust and terror. And my father completely snapped. The carefully constructed illusion was entirely shattered, and the unhinged monster underneath finally broke free. He let out a horrifying, guttural scream of pure rage. "Turn it off. Cut the power. She's clinically insane," he roared, lunging aggressively across the stage directly toward me. His face was entirely red, his eyes bulging out of his skull, his hands reaching out to choke my throat, that I didn't move a single inch. I just stood there, staring at the pathetic, ruined man who had tortured me my entire life. Before his hands could even touch my dress, two massive, heavily armored security guards aggressively tackled him from the side. These weren't his loyal guards. Julian had used my secret emergency cash to heavily bribe the local stage crew and substitute his own private security team for the night. They slammed Arthur face first into the hard wooden floorboards of the stage. The sickening crack of his nose breaking echoed loudly through the front rows. They pinned his arms violently behind his back, pressing their knees heavily into his spine. "Get off me. I own this city. I own her," my father screamed, spitting blood onto the stage. Thrashing wildly under the massive weight of the guards, I looked up at the VIP balcony. Marcus had realized exactly what was happening. The ledgers on the massive screens didn't just expose my father. They exposed Marcus's entire underground financial network. His face was completely pale. He immediately jumped up from his expensive leather seat, aggressively signaling his personal team of heavily armed bodyguards to get him out of the building. He was actively trying to run, but Julian had already planned for that. Over the massive theater speakers, cutting through the chaotic screaming of the crowd, the loud, unmistakable sound of heavy police sirens began wailing aggressively from the streets outside. Julian had sent the entire cache of evidence to the federal authorities 30 minutes before the concert even started. The building was already completely surrounded by law enforcement. However, Marcus was not a man who surrendered to the police without a violent physical fight. I watched in absolute horror as Marcus's bodyguards pulled out heavy, suppressed handguns right in the middle of the crowded balcony. They began aggressively shoving innocent people out of the way, aiming their weapons directly down at the stage. They weren't just trying to escape the theater. They were actively trying to eliminate the two people who had just completely destroyed their multi-million-dollar empire. My father, and me point one of the bodyguards, raised his gun, the cold steel barrel pointing directly at my chest. The blinding stage lights reflected off the weapon. The deafening screams of the panicked audience completely drowned out everything else. But in that exact, terrifying fraction of a second, I realized that surviving my father's toxic cage was only the beginning. Now, I had to physically survive the violent fallout. Get your head down right now unless you want your brains painted across that expensive piano. Clara! Julian screamed those words at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice completely raw, as he vaulted over the audio mixing board and sprinted directly toward the stage. The very first gunshot cracked through the heavy, tense air of the theater. It was the absolute loudest thing I had ever heard in my entire life, infinitely louder than any orchestral crescendo my father had ever conducted. The heavy caliber bullet smashed directly into the polished wooden lid of the Steinway grand piano, just inches away from my waist. Splinters of expensive, glossy black would violently exploded into my face. The entire theater, packed with 5,000 elite guests, instantly turned into a stampeding herd of terrified, mindless animals. The wealthy politicians and harsh music critics who had just been clapping for me were now screaming, shoving, and aggressively trampling over expensive silk dresses and dropped champagne glasses to reach the exit doors. Marcus's bodyguards weren't aiming to specifically assassinate me anymore. They were shooting wildly at the ceiling, shattering the massive, multi-million-dollar crystal chandeliers to create total, blinding panic so their billionaire boss could slip out the back entrance unseen. Shards of glass rained down onto the velvet seats like deadly hailstones. Julian tackled me hard around the waist, dragging my body down behind the thick, heavily reinforced base of the grand piano. The massive stage lights above us flickered wildly from the electrical surges. The police are breaching the front lobby doors right now. Julian yelled directly into my ear over the deafening noise of the crowd, shielding my head with his arms. Just stay right here on the floor. Do not move a single inch. But staying still was a luxury I didn't have. I peeked around the massive wooden leg of the piano. The two private security guards who had successfully pinned my father to the floorboards were suddenly forced to dive for cover when Marcus's men started firing blindly near the stage monitors. In that split second of chaotic distraction, my father violently twisted free. His nose was completely smashed, blood pouring down his chin and staining his expensive white tuxedo shirt. But he didn't run toward the emergency exit like a normal, rational person escaping a shootout. His eyes, completely wild and totally unhinged, locked directly onto me. If his multi-million-dollar empire was burning to the ground tonight, he was absolutely going to make sure his prized merchandise burned right along with it. He grabbed the heavy, solid steel base of the broken microphone stand from the floor. He gripped the metal pole like a baseball bat and started sprinting across the chaotic stage directly toward the piano. "He's coming." I screamed at Julian, grabbing his shoulder. But Julian was already pulling his own concealed weapon, a small, dark handgun I didn't even know he had brought with him. Before Julian could even aim, a bodyguard from the VIP balcony fired another suppressive shot, forcing Julian to duck hard behind the piano bench. I was completely on my own. I didn't freeze. I didn't cry. The nerve inhibitor was totally flushed from my system, and my brain was running purely on intense, aggressive adrenaline. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my heavy crimson silk gown tearing violently against the rough wooden floorboards of the stage. I knew the layout of the Royal Theatre better than I knew my own bedroom. Right behind the main velvet curtain line was a hydraulic trapdoor, traditionally used for dramatic theatrical lifts during massive operas. I crawled frantically toward it, my fingers desperately searching for the small, recessed manual release lever hidden underneath the edge of the floorboards, and my father swung the heavy steel pipe with all his might, smashing it into the side of the piano with a sickening, deafening crash, right exactly where my head had been just a second ago. I finally found the cold metal lever, pulled it hard, and the wooden floor beneath me instantly gave way. I dropped 6 feet straight down into the pitch-black understage storage pit, landing hard on a massive pile of dusty canvas drop cloths. Before the heavy hydraulic doors could automatically close back up, my father jumped down into the darkness right after me. The thick wooden doors slammed shut above us, immediately muffling the chaotic screams and the heavy gunfire of the main theater above. We were completely trapped together in the freezing, claustrophobic maze beneath the stage. The air down here was thick and heavy, smelling intensely of stale sweat, old chemical paint, and rat poison. I aggressively ripped the heavy, restrictive skirt of my crimson dress off, leaving me in just the torn silk bodice and my bare feet. I needed to move fast and silently. I crept behind a massive, towering rack of old theater props and heavy sandbags. I could hear him breathing heavily in the dark, his expensive dress shoes crunching slowly and deliberately on the dirty concrete floor. The only light came from thin, dusty slivers bleeding through the cracks in the stage floorboards above our heads. "You stupid, ungrateful little bitch," his voice echoed through the dark concrete pillars, dripping with absolute, terrifying poison. "Did you really think you could humiliate me? Me. I am Arthur Vance. I made you. Every single note you play, every single dollar you have, every single breath you take belongs exclusively to me. Without me, you are absolutely nothing. You are just a pathetic, weak orphan who can barely tie her own shoes without my permission." His toxic words echoed in the dark, but they didn't paralyze me anymore. They just made me incredibly angry. A cold, highly calculating anger. He was actively trying to use his old psychological triggers, trying to make me feel small, confused, and dependent like I was back on the medication. But I wasn't his drugged nightingale anymore. I quietly reached down and grabbed a heavy, solid iron theatrical stage weight from the floor. It weighed at least 10 pounds. My hands, the very same hands he had insured for millions of dollars, the hands he had threatened to permanently shatter with a wrench just yesterday, gripped the cold iron tightly. Above us, the heavy, thudding boots of the federal tactical police units finally swarmed the main stage. I could hear the muffled shouts of officers, screaming orders, and aggressively arresting Marcus's remaining men. But down here in the dark, it was just the two of us, the ultimate cat-and-mouse game. "Clara!" he whispered into the darkness, his voice suddenly dropping back into that sickeningly sweet, fake fatherly tone he used for the cameras. "Come out, darling. I'm not going to hurt you. We can easily fix this. We can hire the best lawyers and tell the police it was a deepfake video. We can say that journalists manipulated your delicate mind. I forgive you, sweetie. I really do. Just come to Papa so we can go home." I didn't make a single sound. I completely slowed my breathing, waiting in the pitch black as his slow footsteps got closer and closer to my hiding spot. He walked right past the massive prop rack I was crouching behind. I saw his dark silhouette in the faint sliver of light falling from the ceiling. He was holding the heavy steel pipe tightly with both hands, his muscles tensed, completely ready to bash my skull in the second he saw me. He wasn't looking for his daughter. He was hunting a loose end that I knew that if I stayed hidden, he would eventually find me before the police figured out how to open the trapdoor. I had to end this right now. I stepped out from the deep shadows directly behind him. Raising the heavy iron stage weight high into the freezing air, he must have heard my bare foot scrape against the concrete, because he violently spun around, swinging the heavy steel pipe directly at my head with lethal, blinding speed. "Did you honestly think the police would reach down here before I finished exactly what I started with your mother 10 years ago?" The heavy steel pipe sliced through the freezing, stale air of the understage storage pit with a terrifying, high-pitched whistle. I didn't try to block it. I threw my entire body backward, dropping flat against the cold concrete floor. The pipe smashed violently into the massive prop rack right behind me, shattering thick wooden beams and sending a shower of sharp splinters raining down onto my bare shoulders. My father lost his balance for a fraction of a second from the pure, aggressive force of his missed swing. That was my absolutely only chance, and I took it that I didn't hesitate. I gripped the heavy, 10-pound iron stage weight with both hands, using my legs to launch myself upward, and swung it directly at his left knee. The solid iron connected with his kneecap with a sickening, loud crunch. My father let out an agonized, guttural scream and completely collapsed, dropping the steel pipe onto the concrete. But even in blinding pain, he was still a relentless predator. As he went down, his large hand shot out and aggressively grabbed my right ankle. He pulled hard, yanking my legs out from under me. I hit the hard ground chin first, my teeth biting down so hard on my lower lip that I instantly tasted hot, metallic blood. He started dragging himself over my body, pinning my legs down with his heavy frame. His hands immediately reached for my throat. His thumbs dug viciously into my windpipe, completely cutting off my oxygen. I thrashed wildly, my fingernails violently clawing at his face, his eyes tearing at his expensive, blood-soaked tuxedo shirt. He didn't even blink. His face was twisted into a horrifying mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. My vision started blurring at the edges, turning dark and fuzzy. My lungs were aggressively burning, begging for a single ounce of air. I could literally feel my pulse pounding violently against his thumbs. "You ruined everything!" He spit the words directly into my face, his saliva mixing with the blood pouring from his broken nose. "You are my property. If I can't sell you, I will break you into a million pieces." I was actively losing consciousness. My hands were getting weak. The heavy darkness of the basement was fully taking over my brain. But right at that exact, terrifying second, the massive wooden hydraulic doors directly above our heads were violently ripped open. Blinding, high-intensity tactical flashlights violently pierced the pitch-black darkness of the pit, completely destroying the shadows. Before my father could even react, 3 heavy red laser sights painted his face and chest. "Drop your hands right now. Do not move a single muscle," a deep, heavily amplified voice roared from above. Why father froze. The absolute shock of the blinding lights and the aggressive police presence completely shattered his unhinged focus. He slowly lifted his hands off my throat. I immediately rolled over onto my side, violently gasping for air, coughing and choking loudly as oxygen violently rushed back into my burning lungs. Within seconds, heavily armored SWAT officers rappelled down the trapdoor opening. They aggressively tackled Arthur to the ground, slamming his face hard against the dirty concrete. They violently pulled his arms behind his back, securing thick, heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. He started thrashing again, completely losing his mind. He wasn't acting like a distinguished musical legend anymore. He looked like a wild, rabid animal. "I am Arthur Vance. I own this city. You can't touch me. I'll have all your badges," he screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing aggressively through the basement. The officers completely ignored his ranting. They hauled him up by his armpits and dragged him aggressively toward the concrete stairs leading up to the backstage area. I sat there on the freezing floor, shivering uncontrollably, holding my bruised throat. Julian quickly climbed down the ladder, ignoring the police protocols, and ran directly toward me. His face was entirely pale, covered in sweat and dust. He stripped off his heavy jacket and wrapped it tightly around my torn, freezing shoulders. "I've got you, Clara. It's over. It's completely over," Julian whispered, pulling me up to my feet. We slowly walked up the concrete stairs and emerged back onto the main stage. The entire theater was completely unrecognizable. It looked exactly like a massive, expensive war zone. The heavy velvet curtains were torn down. The multi-million-dollar crystal chandeliers were shattered across the velvet seats. Hundreds of uniformed police officers were aggressively swarming the building, securing exits and aggressively cordoning off the VIP balcony where Marcus's men had fired their weapons. The massive projector screens behind the piano were still aggressively flashing the high-resolution evidence of my father's crimes, brightly illuminating the chaotic scene. The audio feed was still live, broadcasting the eerie silence of the empty theater point. 2 female paramedics rushed over to me, wrapping a thick thermal blanket around my shoulders and shining a small medical light into my eyes to check for a concussion. I let them do their job, but my eyes were entirely locked on the main lobby doors. I watched as the police aggressively marched Arthur Vance right through the grand lobby. The remaining paparazzi, who had been completely locked outside during the violent shootout, were now violently pressing their camera lenses against the glass doors. The brilliant Blinding flashes of 100 cameras captured every single angle of the great Arthur Vance in heavy metal handcuffs, his expensive tuxedo ruined, his face covered in blood, being shoved aggressively into the back of a heavily armored police cruiser. It was the exact opposite of the perfectly curated, flawless image he had aggressively maintained for his entire life. The monster was finally exposed to the absolute harsh light of the real world. Julian sat next to me on the edge of the broken stage, drinking a bottle of water. Marcus managed to slip out the back alley during the initial shooting, Julian said directly, his tone completely flat and serious. But it doesn't matter. The federal financial authorities already have the offshore ledgers we projected on the screens. His entire billionaire empire is currently being frozen as we speak. He's going to spend the rest of his life aggressively running from international police. I just nodded slowly, pulling the heavy thermal blanket tighter around my shoulders. The intense, violent adrenaline was finally starting to crash, leaving me feeling incredibly hollow, physically exhausted and strangely light. For the very first time in 15 years, my mind was entirely my own. There were no nerve inhibitors in my bloodstream. There were no heavy, deadlocking contracts dictating my schedule. And most importantly, there was no father aggressively watching my every single move from the shadows an hour later. I was sitting in the brightly lit, sterile interrogation room at the Central Police Precinct. The local detective had just finished taking my official, hours-long statement. He took the loaded USB drive, the recording pin, and the torn napkin my mother had written, placing them securely into clear plastic evidence bags. He assured me that Arthur Vance was currently sitting in a maximum security holding cell, completely denied bail due to his massive flight risk and the extreme violence of the evening, that I was officially free. I could walk out of the front doors of that police station and go wherever I wanted, do whatever I wanted, and play whatever music I chose. But just as the detective opened the heavy door to let me out, Julian walked into the room. He didn't look relieved. He looked incredibly tense. He was holding his smartphone, his thumb hovering over the screen. "Clara, you need to see this right now," Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual arrogant confidence. I took the phone from his hands. I assumed the live broadcast of the concert had been cut the second the first gunshot rang out. I was completely wrong. The automated theater cameras had kept rolling the entire time. The whole world, millions of people, had watched the terrifying shootout, the chaotic panic, and the aggressive arrest in real time. But that wasn't the shocking part. The truly shocking part was the viral video currently trending at #1 across every single platform. It was a close-up angle of my father sitting handcuffed in the back of the dark police cruiser just minutes ago. He wasn't screaming or thrashing anymore. He was staring directly into the lens of a local news camera through the rolled-down window, smiling that sick, cold, calculated smile. And he was whispering a specific, terrifying message directly to me. "You might have successfully broken the cage, my sweet little nightingale, but the most lethal poison I ever gave you wasn't in your morning tea. It is permanently running through your blood." The audio from Julian's smartphone speaker was terrible, heavily distorted by the loud sirens and the chaotic screaming of the paparazzi, but my father's cold, arrogant whisper cut through the noise like a jagged piece of glass. I sat frozen in the sterile police interrogation room, staring at the small screen. The viral video showed Arthur Vance sitting in the back of the heavily armored police cruiser, his tuxedo completely ruined with his own blood, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. Yet, he didn't look like a defeated man. He stared directly into the flashing camera lens, his eyes completely dead and devoid of any human emotion, delivering that terrifying final message straight to me. Julian aggressively snatched the phone away, quickly hitting the lock button so the screen went completely black. He ran a hand through his dusty hair, looking incredibly frustrated. He started pacing the small, brightly lit room, muttering under his breath about narcissistic psychopaths and their desperate need for the last word. Julian tried to assure me it was just a pathetic, empty threat from a completely ruined man who had just lost his multi-million-dollar empire. He told me to ignore it, to focus on the fact that Arthur was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding cell with absolutely zero chance of making bail. But I knew my father better than anyone else on this earth. Arthur Vance never made empty threats. Every single word he ever spoke was a highly calculated move on his twisted chessboard. "Julian," I whispered, my voice still hoarse from being strangled just hours ago. "He isn't talking about a literal poison. He's talking about my music. He's talking about my identity." For my entire 24 years of existence, Arthur had violently drilled one specific, toxic narrative into my brain. I was entirely his creation. He claimed he was the grand architect of my genius, the brilliant maestro who took a weak, pathetic orphan and molded her into a global piano prodigy. He always told me that without his strict guidance, his aggressive schedules, and his superior genetics, I was absolutely nothing. He wanted me to believe that the poison in my blood was his own toxic legacy, that no matter how far I ran, I would always just be a manufactured extension of his ego. I would never actually be a real artist. I stood up from the cold metal chair, letting the paramedic's thermal blanket drop to the floor. My torn crimson silk dress was stained with dirt and dried blood, but I didn't care. I looked directly at Julian. "I need to go back to the mansion right now." Julian stopped pacing and looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. "Clara, the mansion is currently an active federal crime scene. The police are tearing the place apart looking for Marcus's offshore financial documents. You cannot go back there. It's the middle of the night, and you just survived a literal murder attempt." "I don't care," I said, my voice completely steady and aggressively determined. "He has a hidden safe in his master bedroom, not the digital one in the music room with the financial ledgers. I'm talking about his personal, private vault, the one he built behind the massive oil painting of himself. He always told me it held the original manuscripts of his greatest symphonies. If I am ever going to truly escape his shadow, I need to know exactly what he is hiding in there before the federal authorities seize everything." Julian stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He saw the absolute, burning resolve in my eyes. He didn't argue anymore. He simply nodded, grabbed his heavy jacket, and opened the door. Julian used his high-level press credentials and a massive personal favor from the lead detective to get us a 20-minute, strictly supervised window to enter the Bellaria mansion to pack essential overnight clothing. The drive back up into the isolated hills was completely silent. When we pulled up to the sprawling estate, it looked entirely alien. The usually pristine, intimidating driveway was completely swamped with flashing police cruisers, bright floodlights, and federal agents aggressively carrying out boxes of evidence. A uniformed officer escorted us through the heavy front doors and told us we had exactly 20 minutes before the forensic accounting team locked down the upper floors. Walking through the grand, silent hallways of the mansion felt incredibly surreal. The house had always felt like a heavy, suffocating mausoleum, but tonight the terrifying power it held over me was completely gone. The monster was finally removed from the castle. I walked straight past my own bedroom and headed directly to the end of the hall. Arthur's master suite. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. The room smelled overwhelmingly of his expensive cologne and stale cigars. I walked straight over to the massive, terrifyingly arrogant, floor-to-ceiling oil painting of him conducting an orchestra. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the heavy, gilded wooden frame and violently yanked it away from the wall. The heavy painting crashed to the hardwood floor, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Right behind it, embedded deeply into the plaster, was a heavy steel combination safe. "Do you know the code?" Julian asked, standing nervously by the door watching the hallway. "He is the ultimate narcissist," I replied, staring at the cold metal keypad. "He thinks his birth is the most important event in human history." I quickly typed in his full birth date. The heavy steel mechanism clicked loudly, and the thick door slowly swung open. I reached inside and pulled out a stack of incredibly old, heavily yellowed leather-bound journals and a massive pile of original, handwritten sheet music. The pages were incredibly brittle, smelling strongly of age and dried ink. I carefully opened the very first piece of sheet music. It was the original manuscript for the Bellaria Symphony, the exact piece of music that had made Arthur Vance a global, untouchable legend 20 years ago. The piece that had won him countless awards and built his entire massive fortune. But as I looked closer at the top right corner of the fragile paper, my heart completely stopped. The blood violently drained from my face. My hand started to shake uncontrollably. The handwriting on the musical notes wasn't Arthur's. His handwriting was large, aggressive, and incredibly sloppy. This handwriting was delicate, meticulous, and frantically fast. It was the exact same handwriting I had seen on the hidden letters inside the old upright piano. It was my mother's handwriting, and right there, crossed out violently with thick black ink, was her original signature. Arthur had literally scratched her name out and aggressively written his own over it. I frantically tore through the rest of the heavy leather journals. Every single one of his famous compositions, every single award-winning symphony, every single brilliant arrangement that had cemented his status as a musical genius. They were all entirely stolen. Arthur Vance wasn't a musical prodigy. He wasn't a genius. He was a complete, absolute fraud. He had violently stolen my mother's incredible talent, built his entire multi-million-dollar empire on her secret genius, and when she finally tried to run away with me, he murdered her to protect his stolen legacy. "The poison in your blood," I whispered into the empty, silent room, tears finally spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. He wanted me to believe that my talent was just a byproduct of his greatness. He wanted me to believe that without him, I was nothing. But the exact opposite was the terrifying, beautiful truth. The genius didn't come from him. The music, the passion, the brilliant, undeniable talent, it all came from her. It was always my mother. I wasn't Arthur Vance's manufactured merchandise. I was the living, breathing continuation of the brilliant woman he had desperately tried to erase from history. I aggressively gathered every single piece of the stolen sheet music and shoved them into my heavy canvas duffel bag. I wasn't just going to hand this over to the police to be filed away in some dark federal evidence locker. I was going to use it to completely, utterly obliterate his legacy. I was going to make sure the entire world knew exactly who the real genius of the family was. "We have to go, Clara. The federal agents are coming up the stairs," Julian urged, checking his watch frantically. I zipped the heavy bag shut, stood up straight, and looked around the dark, oppressive bedroom one final time. I felt a massive, invisible weight completely lift off my crushed shoulders. The terrifying ghost of Arthur Vance no longer haunted me. His sick, twisted psychological grip was permanently broken. I threw the heavy bag over my shoulder and walked out of his bedroom without ever looking back. But as I reached the bottom of the grand staircase, my hand brushed against the cold brass handle of the front door. I realized that destroying Arthur's legacy was only half of the final equation. To truly break free, to truly reclaim my own stolen life, I couldn't just expose his horrific lies. I had to finally speak my own truth. The final concert at the Royal Theatre had been violently interrupted. The world had heard the screams, the gunshots, and the terrifying revelations, but they hadn't actually heard the most important thing of all. They hadn't heard me played. I looked at Julian, a new, completely unbreakable fire burning aggressively in my chest. Tomorrow morning, I wasn't going to hide from the press. I wasn't going to retreat into the shadows as the traumatized, broken victim of a wealthy monster. I was going to do the one thing Arthur Vance feared more than prison, more than bankruptcy, and more than death itself. I was going to play my mother's unfinished symphony, and I was going to finish it with my own bare hands. If you sit at that piano today and miss a single note, or if your hands shake even a little bit, the entire world will instantly believe his sick narrative. They will write you off as a medicated puppet who is nothing without her master. Julian looked me dead in the eyes and said those exact words as we stood in the backstage holding room of the Bellaria National Music Academy the very next morning. I didn't flinch. I just tightened the belt of my simple black wool coat and looked at my reflection in the dressing room mirror. The heavy, restrictive crimson gown was gone, sitting in a police evidence locker, and so was the thick, suffocating stage makeup my father used to force on me. Today, I wasn't wearing a costume. I wasn't playing the role of the tragic, fragile prodigy. The viral video of my father's desperate, arrogant threat from the back of the police cruiser had already been viewed over 50 million times. The global media was aggressively pushing a new, incredibly toxic narrative. Yes, Arthur Vance was a violent criminal, but maybe he was right about his daughter's talent. Maybe the brilliant Clara Vance was entirely manufactured by his strict control and the nerve inhibitors he secretly fed her. I was about to walk out there and completely destroy that narrative. Julian had used every single media connection he had to organize an emergency, live broadcast press conference directly on the massive front steps of the Academy. This was the exact location where Arthur was supposed to be inaugurated as the honorary director today. Instead, Arthur was currently sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell wearing an orange jumpsuit. When Julian and I pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked out onto the grand marble steps, the noise of the crowd was completely deafening. Thousands of reporters, elite music critics, and aggressive paparazzi were packed into the plaza. News helicopters hovered loudly overhead. That I didn't walk up to the cluster of microphones right away. I walked straight past them toward the instrument Julian had arranged for me. It wasn't an expensive, flawlessly polished, 9-foot Steinway grand piano like the one I had left behind at the Royal Theatre. It was an older, slightly battered, upright acoustic piano. It was an exact replica of the one my mother used to play in our old storage room that I stood in front of the massive crowd. The aggressive flashing of camera lenses temporarily blinded me, but I didn't look down. I pulled the thick, heavily yellowed, leather-bound journal out of my canvas duffel bag, the exact same journal I had stolen from my father's hidden wall safe just hours ago. I walked over to the main microphone, my bare hands gripping the cold, fragile paper. For 15 years, you all believed a massive, carefully constructed lie, I said, my voice echoing clearly and aggressively across the massive plaza, cutting completely through the noise of the helicopters. You believed that Arthur Vance was a once-in-a-generation musical genius. You believed that he was the brilliant architect behind my entire career. But Arthur Vance never wrote a single note of his famous symphonies. He is a complete, absolute fraud. The crowd erupted into a chaotic frenzy of shouted questions. But I didn't stop talking. I held the ancient, brittle manuscript high up in the air for every single camera lens to capture. This is the original, handwritten manuscript for the Bellaria Symphony, I continued, my voice steady, completely devoid of any fear. The handwriting on these pages does not belong to Arthur. It belongs to his late wife, my mother. She was the real genius. He violently stole her work, aggressively crossed out her name, built his entire multi-million-dollar empire on her stolen talent, and when she tried to expose him and run away with me, he murdered her in cold blood to protect his fake legacy. I watched the faces of the elite music critics in the front row completely drop in absolute horror. The shocking truth was finally out in the open air, where my father couldn't manipulate it or buy its silence anymore. But words on a piece of paper weren't enough to fully break his toxic grip on my life. He had publicly claimed that the music inside my blood was his poison. He claimed I couldn't play without him. Arthur Vance told the world last night that I am absolutely nothing without his guidance, I said, looking directly into the main television camera, knowing my father was likely watching this live feed from his jail cell. He told you all that my talent was just his manufactured creation. I am not going to argue with him. I am simply going to show him exactly who I am. I dropped the microphone, walked over to the old upright piano, and sat down on the hard wooden bench. I placed my mother's original, yellowed manuscript on the music stand. I took a deep, heavy breath, feeling the cold morning air fill my lungs. For the first time in over a decade, There was absolutely no nerve inhibitor flowing through my veins. My mind was incredibly sharp, fast, and entirely my own that I raised my hands and pressed my fingers aggressively into the keys. I didn't play Beethoven, and I didn't play Mozart. I started playing the exact notes written on my mother's yellowed paper. It was the raw, original version of the Bellaria Symphony, completely stripped of the heavy, arrogant, overproduced arrangements my father had violently forced onto it over the years. The music was beautifully sad, frantic, and incredibly powerful. It sounded like a woman desperately trying to break out of a locked cage. The massive crowd of reporters went completely dead silent. The only sound in the entire plaza was the heavy, emotional striking of the piano keys, but I didn't stop there. As I reached the final page of my mother's stolen manuscript, the notes abruptly ended. It was an unfinished symphony. This was the exact point where Arthur had always taken over, forcing his own rigid, soulless ending onto her beautiful work. I didn't play Arthur's ending. I closed my eyes, let my hands hover over the keys for a fraction of a second, and then I started to play something entirely new. I played a piece of music I had secretly written in my head while sitting in the freezing dark of the mansion's basement. It wasn't in any of my father's strict curriculums. It was aggressive, it was breathtakingly fast, and it was undeniably brilliant. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated anger transforming into absolute, unbreakable freedom. I poured every single ounce of my pain, my lost childhood, and my burning rage directly into the heavy wooden keys. My hands moved flawlessly, striking the complex chords of the power I didn't even know I possessed. When I finally hit the last thunderous chord, the final note echoed loudly off the massive marble columns of the Academy. I slowly lowered my hands to my lap. For 10 agonizing seconds, the entire plaza was completely frozen in dead silence. And then the explosion happened. It wasn't just polite, golf clap applause from wealthy investors. It was a massive, roaring, deafening standing ovation from thousands of hardened journalists and critics. They were cheering, screaming my name, completely overwhelmed by the undeniable, raw truth of the performance. They knew. The whole world instantly knew. Arthur Vance was just a pathetic, abusive parasite. The true genius of the Vance family had just reclaimed her throne, and she did it entirely on her own point 3 days later. The massive dust storm of the federal investigation finally settled. Arthur was officially indicted on multiple federal charges, including massive financial fraud, extortion, and the premeditated murder of my mother. He was permanently denied bail. Marcus, the billionaire buyer, was caught by international police trying to board a private jet out of the country. The sprawling, toxic mansion in the hills was completely seized by the government that I didn't stay in the city to watch them rot. I rented a small, quiet car and drove 3 hours out into the heavy, green countryside. The air out here was incredibly clean and quiet. I walked slowly through the old, wrought iron gates of the quiet cemetery. I carried 2 things in my hands. One was a fresh bouquet of simple white daisies. The other was the massive, heavy international piano trophy I had won just a week ago. The exact same trophy I had been holding when I first heard my father selling me in the theater hallway that I stopped in front of a simple, gray headstone. My mother's name was carved deeply into the stone. I knelt down on the damp grass. I placed the fresh flowers gently against the cold stone, and then I set the heavy, prestigious trophy right next to them. "He's gone, Mom," I whispered into the quiet breeze. "He can't hurt us anymore. I finished your symphony, and I made sure the whole world knows your name." I stood up, taking a long, deep breath. The crushing, suffocating weight I had carried on my chest for 15 years was completely gone. I looked at the trophy one last time, completely indifferent to the shiny, expensive metal. It was just an object. My true power wasn't inside a glass case, and it certainly wasn't inside Arthur Vance's heavy steel safe. It was inside my hands. I turned my back to the grave and started walking back down the quiet dirt path. I finally smiled. The terrifying cage was permanently broken, The nightingale was finally free, and from now on, I was the only one writing the melody of my life.